not too far into 2017 to the end of last year, basically.
This is one of the more beautiful books I've seen, I guess, and I can hear us in headphones, which means we're live.
We are live.
So welcome Joseph Rex Young to the Department of Conversation, and just as we're talking, we'll just finish it off. This is one of the more beautiful looking books I've seen for a very long time, but I guess if you're going to be somewhat of an expert and somewhat of an academic in George R.R. Martin, this fits that theme of fantasy very well, but it looks beautiful.
Well, to an extent, I mean, the publishers they're an academic style commercial publisher, so they don't.
Right. Who is it? Who is the publisher?
Routledge.
Okay.
So they're not. They're not really in the business of
putting dragons on the cover.
Well, that's a valid point. I mean, they gave me a page of swatches of potential cover designs and said which of these would your name look best on. And and I chose that one because it does seem to be appropriate to Martin's milieu, but conversely, it does sort of peg me as a bit of a Tyrrell partisan, because those, of course, are Tyrrell colours, and it's a botanically themed design. So I don't wish to suggest I am specifically a Tyrrell partisan, but yeah, that's an interesting side effect.
So we found you actually just earlier this week. This has come together quite quickly, so thank you for making yourself available. There's an article in the ODT about you, and it seemed that the summation of the article, not to downplay it, was you were thinking that a couple of the seasons of the series of Game of Thrones were a bit boring. The books are much better, and this is what some of your writing is about. But a lot, and if you look at your LinkedIn page, a lot of your writing, a lot of your publications seem to be about George R.R. Martin. So, would you be New Zealand's foremost expert in Song of Ice?
Song of Ice and Fire.
Do you think that's probably a pretty fair statement?
Well, it's potentially a rash statement, but I don't know any other New Zealanders who've managed to publish a book on the subject. So in an academic sense, probably yes. That's probably just about fair. I mean, what I am is I'm a scholar of the intellectual history and abstract structure of modern fantasy literature.
Right.
And I've done a lot of work on that. I've got. I mean, the author I've actually published most on is a guy named E.R. Edison, who produced some profoundly deep and powerful philosophical novels during the period of the two world wars.
Okay.
But in order to do that work and to do work on other authors like Mervyn Peake and so forth, I had to become very, very closely acquainted with how fantasy as a genre works and what its history is, and when Game of Thrones blew up in 2011, I looked at some shorts on YouTube, and I thought, because I don't have Sky. And I said, that actually looks like the kind of thing I've been waiting for on TV since Robin of Sherwood played out in the 1980s.
I remember Robin of Sherwood in the 80s. I remember watching that on a Wednesday night.
Pretty pivotal show, I would think, for my intellectual development. But I said, we haven't had anything like this on TV for like upwards of 20 years.
Yeah.
I said, I'm going to have a look at that. But because I'm a scholar of fantasy literature, it behooves me that my first impressions of those characters and those situations be made via the written word rather than the moving image.
Sure.
So I sat down, read all the books. They are a lot. They look a lot more intimidating than they are.
Mm-hmm.
Martin's a very fluid and fluent writer. You can knock out several chapters a night of his work. And I think the books are better than the TV series generally. But having done that, I then sort of sat down and started watching the TV series. And again, I think the TV series is a lot of fun, and I think it's just about bloody time we had something like this on TV. But a lot of the discussion that surrounded Martin and surrounded the TV show was how tremendously transgressive it was, and how it broke all the rules, and how it's not doing what a fantasy is supposed to be doing, and everything like that.
Like, for example, main characters being killed off left, right, and centre.
Well, the famous one, actually, there's a friend of mine actually who came up with a great quote, which I actually put in a draft of the book and took out again because I couldn't attribute it, but who said, I was just sort of watching it for the sets and costumes because I thought they were cool, but then they killed Sean Bean, and I thought, wow, that's incredible.
Yeah,
and
spoilers.
Well,
I can't want a series. It's series 1, isn't it?
Spoilers for something that aired 8 years ago.
Yeah.
I was about to watch it. No, I'm joking.
And so it has a reputation for being very narratively unpredictable and morally ambiguous.
Yeah.
And people said this is great. This is way more interesting. One person described it as the Lord of the Rings for adults, which is tremendously demeaning to Tolkien. But Tolkien has weathered far more demeaning comments than that. And we won't go there. The point is, from my perspective, as someone who has some background in how fantasy works as a genre, what immediately struck me upon looking at this narrative on page and screen was actually how many rules it was following.
Okay.
And how in many respects how very conventional it was. And what struck me as remarkable and impressive about it wasn't that it was breaking rules, but that it was following all the rules at once.
So why do you think that the public, obviously you're an academic and you've done a lot of work in this area, but why do you think the public thought it was breaking rules, even though you say it's obviously following rules? Well, where's the disconnect?
Because the public perception of fantasy is generally shaped by whatever fraction of the Lord of the Rings a person can be bothered reading in fifth form,
or Harry Potter.
Yeah,
and this next generation.
It's not. I mean, people get a very set idea about what fantasy is, what it can do, and how it's supposed to work, which doesn't take into account a lot of what scholars, for example, like Tolkien and C.S. Lewis were talking about. Back in the 40s and 50s, and doesn't take into account a lot of the way that fantasy works as a genre, as a collection of author fiats and obligations. So. And people get a very, very set idea about what a fantasy is supposed to be doing, and when they were presented with a story which famously kills off the putative protagonist 3/4 of the way through volume 1 of a 7-volume story, they go, wow, that's really unusual.
Do you think they get a set idea about what fantasy is supposed to do, or just in this age of Hollywood endings and movies, just of what literature and or movies are supposed to do? In other words, any literature or movie, fantasy or not, if the chief protagonist was killed off on page 3, they'd be like, holy crap, this is different, be it fantasy or not fantasy.
Well, that's possibly true. I mean, it's actually interesting looking back over the span of Martin's narrative, how few characters have died once you take out the characters who were clearly there to be killed off.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting because I mean, towards the end of the series, and I haven't read the books, but I've seen the series, there was that 3 to go, 2 to go, this is the last one. People were doing the opposite. They were going, holy crap, why aren't people dying? They should never have survived that battle. More should have died. This is not what this series has been about. So then it sort of started to work against them a bit in the end, because everyone survived the impossible, whereas at the start everyone was being killed by the probable.
Well, yes, I mean there was that infamous battle sequence in season 7, wasn't there, where they had seven guys stuck on a rocky outcrop surrounded by the army of the dead.
Yep.
And then 6 of them survive, and the one who died of injuries sustained in an earlier fight.
Yeah.
And people say, well, what was the point of that? But again, I mean, of course, in the penultimate episode, I think they knocked over was it 7 or 8 characters.
I think the second to last episode, I think the one that annoyed people that would appear to be, looking on the Dr. Google and the various social media experts was is it Brienne of Tarth, Brienne of Tarth, and Jaime Lannister, who literally had the army of the dead all over them, and then they all fell away and they survived. That, but again, it maybe when something is so successful in a model, i.e., no one's special enough to be saved, anyone can be knocked off at any times. They've set themselves up a bit of an impossible. They can't please everybody.
This is a complicated point. I'm writing an article about this at the moment and having great difficulty figuring out exactly how to articulate it in prose. But the basic structure of Game of Thrones, of course, is that you have on page and screen is that you have this tremendous roiling political argument, this battle between these various houses over who's going to rule the fantasy kingdom of Westeros, with this terrible supernatural threat looming, beyond the wall in the north.
Yep.
And what's interesting is, the threat becomes apparent gradually to the character Jon Snow, who's been sent away to the north to the Foreign Legion, basically. And what's interesting to me is that that Jon Snow's subplot works on a different expositional principle to everybody else's. Whereas everybody else is, well, not quite everyone else actually. Bran Stark's subplot is also unusual. But Eddard Stark's, Jon Snow's foster father's subplot, which is the one we think we're supposed to be following for the first season, is what's called an immersive fantasy, which is a very rationalist and skeptical sort of expositional strategy whereby characters talk about the fantasy world as if there's nothing unusual about it, and we, from the context of their discussions, figure out what this world is.
So we accept it. This is what it is.
Well, we don't accept it. It's Bran who has to accept explanations. What we do as readers is we interrogate explanations we get. When we first meet Tyrion Lannister, who's another major character in the books, we first meet him in the TV series when he's actually consorting with a prostitute, which is a character building moment for him, of course. In the books, we first meet him when he's actually researching in a library, which is also another another character building moment for him, because he's a fiercely and aggressively literate character.
Right.
And he goes to the librarian and he said, I've been reading all night. He said, put these books away. Make sure you're careful with the Valyrian scrolls. The parchment is very dry. And we read that and we go, okay, well, what's a Valyrian scroll exactly? It must be something quite valuable. And then from that, after that, we also learn things like we hear characters talk about, and we hear Catelyn Stark talk about her husband's ancestral sword, which is made of Valyrian steel, and she says that she had no love for swords, but she had to admit that a Valyrian blade was beautiful. And we, okay, so there's that word again.
Yeah.
And then we hear when Daenerys Targaryen's being dolled up for a wedding to Khal Drogo. One of the people who's brokered the marriage says, those wonderful eyes of hers are clearly the eyes of Valyrian royalty. We go, okay, there's that word again, and it's never explicitly explained to us what Valyria is, but we learn from an accretion of hints and implicit statements in the narrative that Valyria is kind of like the ancient Greece or ancient Rome to the medieval world.
Well, you certainly learn that there's something very special about it. Obviously, it's like sometimes when I'm involved with something, reading, researching, and I come across a concept or a word that I'm not entirely au fait with, I'll go to the dictionary or I'll Google it or I'll look it up. So this would be in that age one of those words. It has weight to it.
Yeah, that you would go to the dictionary, but of course there is no dictionary for this.
Yeah, of course.
Or at least there wasn't when the books were first published. It now has, I think it has 3 of its own wikis now.
Oh, really?
3 different wikis for this story. We figure out Westeros and its history and its culture and everything, not by having anyone sit down and talk to us. To talk us through it, but by having people just talk about it as if it's normal.
Yeah.
And we, from the context of their discussions, work out that yes, Valyria was this vanished civilization from beforehand, and that fragments of Valyrian culture do circulate in Westeros, and people sort of chase them down and research them. People like Tyrion. So that's immersive fantasy, and that's a really quite tautly rational and rationalistic way of looking at a fantasy world, because not only are we reading rationalizations, Catelyn Stark doesn't usually like swords, but she liked this one because it contained Valyrian steel. That's an argument. That's a rational argument for that Catelyn is presenting for why she finds this sword beautiful. Not only are we reading a series of rational arguments, we are also constructing a rational argument out of those rational arguments for how this fantasy world works, and that's part of the reason that Westeros is so vivid to so many people, is that it follows this sort of expositional technique. It's being argued into existence. We are building it ourselves. Martin hasn't so much created a world as he's sort of compiled a world building kit and then just tipped it onto our desks and said, there you go, make something of that.
Yeah, it's a really clever way to do it. So introducing this idea and then expanding on it for the reader to build.
So that's
cool.
So that, but again, it's very sternly rationalist. It argues against things. I mean, the cost of it. Westeros makes sense because it's built by people making sense of it, both the characters and the reader.
Yep.
But the cost of sense is wonder, as I point out in the book. The result is a rather unglamorous sort of way of looking at the world. It's a very sort of pared down, thinned down world. We are looking at what's actually there, not what's supposed to be there. And of course, as people who are familiar with the story will know, there's a lot of things that are supposed to be working that aren't in this. Things like Westerosi chivalry, which is supposed to be this wonderful, sacrosanct set of rules. And one of the first things we see knights do in this fictional chivalric civilization is a guy in full armor belts a 12-year-old girl with a mailed fist and gives her a fat lip. It's and we look at that and we say, no, hang on, that's not supposed to be happening.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, because that's not what knights are supposed to be doing. And so this is a very recognizable fantasy trope. It's a thinned world. It's a world where things that are supposed to be working aren't working.
It's funny. I mean, so much of life is like that in real life as well. It's like not to pick out anyone in particular, but politicians are supposed to do things a certain way. They're supposed to look after the citizens a certain way, but they kind of don't. And it seems to be not necessarily standalone to a fantasy genre. That seems to be quite close to real life in lots of instances as well. Pastors in a church aren't supposed to fiddle with young boys. They seem to sometimes do it.
That's true, and I mean we are seeing, and of course there is in one of the later books in Martin's series, which in a subplot that didn't actually make it into the TV series, we do in fact actually meet a pedophile cleric. Wow. And again, that this character was not adapted for the TV series for complicated reasons, I think. Basically, I don't think they wanted to pay yet another actor. There's over 2,000 named characters in this story.
Wow.
And although they've got a core cast of 42 for the TV series, which is ridiculously large.
Still massive, yeah.
For a TV series, it's only a small fraction of the characters who made it, who were in the TV series, in the books. Sorry,
it's thinking about a core cast of 2,000 out of the book.
Well, yes,
I do have enough trouble keeping up with the actual names of people of the series, so let alone the books.
Do. I mean, so the point of this is we have a world that's being built, as I say, by a very careful sort of rationalistic way, which produces this sense that this fantasy world is not working. This fantasy society is not working the way it should. You sort of start with what should be happening, and then you argue away from it.
Right.
Whereas, if you look at the way the world beyond the wall is created, where the world that Jon Snow is building in his time with the Night's Watch, that's constructed via a competing expositional principle called intrusion fantasy, whereby something has come into Jon's world that he can't quite make sense of.
Yeah.
And he is and his story is motivated, and his world is built not as he argues away from what's supposed to be happening, but when he notices something that is happening, which isn't supposed to be happening, and argues towards it.
Right.
He is trying to figure out what is wrong, and this just didn't come through quite as well in the TV series. But when Jon first goes beyond the wall to say his Night's Watch vows, there's this wonderfully arranged bit of prose where he talks about the weird sensation he gets from the haunted forest beyond the wall. It's somehow very wrong, and it's very different from all the other forests I've been in, and I can't figure out why.
Right.
And it's like, there's a finger of ice trailing up my spine, and all sorts of things like that. Jon's vocalization, Jon's narration of the haunted forest is of something he can't quite make sense of.
Right.
But something that he admits is something he's quite happy to admit is there's something there. There's something weird out there, and what he does really over the course of his narrative is he pursues that odd truth that there's something out there. And again, I mean, in the books, actually, I've repeatedly compared this to Agent Fox Mulder from the X-Files.
Yeah.
Well, because
something's out there.
The great catchphrase of the X-Files, or one of them, was "the truth is out there."
Yeah.
And that's very much the sort of tension that drives Jon's story, is that there's something going on behind the trees that I can't quite figure out.
Yeah, but he senses it. He knows something's up.
Yeah, and there's the notion that the sensibility itself, this visceral sense that there's something wrong here that I can't make sense of, is that's what's pushing the story forward. If Jon decides that he's being silly and takes a perfectly rational line saying they're just trees, there's no reason to be worried here. If he takes the sort of rational argumentative line that his foster mother Catelyn Stark took with regard to Valyrian swords, then the story stops. Then his story cannot continue until he gets some credulity and starts wanting to believe.
I mean, I hear it in your voice, but the writings of George R.R. Martin, specifically what you're studying at the moment, do you have a love for this? Do you really like it? Has it turned into a job? I mean, you said that this book was 4 years in the making.
Yeah, from the first time I sat down and tried to make sense of something in Martin's narrative in prose. Yeah,
and famously, people don't get rich off writing books.
No.
So it's got to be a passion of yours. It's the overall life and works of George R.R. Martin. Are they a particular special part to you, or is it more the fantasy genre and he's a part of it?
Martin is probably going to be part of my professional life for hopefully for a long time yet. I've been away with the fairies since I was 6 years old, and I love fantasy in as a genre and all its forms, and I always have.
What was it at 6? What was the thing that picked you up that you went, holy crap, this is me?
Well, it's probably actually Robin of Sherwood again.
Oh, right.
And it's very hard to say. I mean, I'm told I was an enormous fan of Peter Pan as a small boy.
Yep.
And that's that's another fantasy and so forth. I mean, and there's been other things going forward. I was always fascinated by sort of how fantasy worlds worked and how and exactly how you could put together an entirely fictional universe and still get people to have some sort of emotional stake in it, because that's what fantasists do basically.
Well, are you also a sci-fi guy? Because I think about, as you're describing that, and I'm thinking about putting together these universes fits perfectly in with sci-fi in that as well. I mean, be it Star Trek or Star Wars or Guardians of the Galaxy, they're also building and developing whole universes and whole worlds, etc.
Yeah, well, science fiction and fantasy are allied genres, I think is possibly the best way of putting it. I mean, personally, I don't really see much point in drawing a distinction between the two. I think they're very similar, and they have a lot. I mean, the scholar who came up with this notion of taxonomizing fantasy based on expositional principles, Farah Mendelssohn, she pointed out that immersive fantasy, the arguing of a world into existence, is very, very similar. It's basically what science fiction does, she said.
Yeah, because I mean, it seems that if you just change the characters, I think when I think fantasy, I think witches and warlocks and goblins and for some reason dark forests and spells and that kind of thing. If I think about science fiction, I just think Jedis and spaceships and planets but that seems. The locations seem to be different, but the storylines and the characters seem to be the same.
So it's just an interesting sort of thought experiment. What about a fantasy novel which actually dealt with the emergence of an entirely new religion in England in the early 20th century and the consequences that would have on public perceptions of the First World War?
Well, that sounds interesting.
Yeah, because that's basically something that that's what E.R. Edison writes about broadly.
So say that again. It's a fantasy. So other than the characters and the locations, which are fairly obvious in my mind, and I might be wrong, what's the difference really between a fantasy and a sci-fi?
Well, again, I don't really think there is one. I mean, I get that people do disagree with me, and that there are people who observe a very, very strong difference between the two. Actually, I remember once they were listening to a radio interview with René Auberjonois, who was the actor who played Odo in Deep Space Nine, who was asked what it was like appearing on a science fiction show, and he very, very firmly shut the interviewer down and said Star Trek is not science fiction, it's fantasy, because he drew a very strong distinction between the two. And again, I'm not going to tell him he's wrong, but there are so many similarities between the two, and the differences are so marginal. I mean, that.
Do you think that, because as a person myself who's much more of a science fiction fan than fantasy, in fact I barely watch any fantasy, but what you're saying is obviously the same sort of thing. Personally, I sort of look at it and say as sci-fi, obviously there's aliens and other planets, but there are often not many science fictions, I can't even think one off the top of my head, that doesn't have Earth and earthly places like New York or Los Angeles or London as being, so Earth is real and then the rest of the galaxy is a fantasy place with aliens and so forth. So
Star Wars.
Except for Star Wars. So
what about Dune?
Yeah, well, June. I haven't. Yeah. And so I'm more thinking of a lot of sort of modern science fiction. Often, so you look at Star Trek, especially the reboots and stuff, and things like Stargate.
So you're saying that science fiction has an element of Earth usually attached to it?
A little bit, yeah. I think, and whereas fantasy often is completely, whilst they're bound by the laws of earthly physics, it's sort of there's no Londons and, well, other than sort of mortal machines.
Well, what about Harry Potter? What about the search for Grindelwald, whatever that kind of stuff? That would be fantasy.
I'd classify that as fantasy, though, wouldn't you?
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying. That has got the Earth location.
And then again, getting
don't make my argument completely.
getting back to again. I mean, I'm not. I wonder how many people who are going to watch this have read any of E.R. Edison's novels, because again, with the best will in the world, he's not terribly popular.
So you just pause for a sec, because the name of the author again from World War I, World War II?
E.R. Edison.
E.R. Edison. Edison like the light bulb.
No, Edison with 2 Ds.
Okay.
Eddison.
So explain to me then, I'm interested, when you say that it's about a religion forming, etc., etc., is it Wiccan, is it goblins and things, or is it more the structure that turns that particular writing into fantasy?
I mean, what's going on in E.R. Edison's novels is this. I mean, they follow the life story of a guy named Edward Lessingham. He's born in I think Edison made him exactly the same age as himself. So he was born in 1882, and he lives and dies at a great age in 1972. So in the future of Edison's world.
Okay.
And he's born and lives in Yorkshire. But over the course of his life, he has a series of quite bizarre adventures in which it becomes apparent that his life is running in partnership with that of another character in a secondary world, in a different world,
like a different realm, a different universe.
Uh-huh. In a place called Zimiamvia, which begins to raise all sorts of interesting questions of which you as the reader have to sort of apply yourself to, about who's the real Lessingham? Is the earthly Lessingham the real one, or the fantasy Lessingham the real one? But Lessingham on Earth, particularly in the last novel Edison wrote that he actually lived to see published, because he died before his last book came out. The relationship between Earth and Zimiamvia starts to become apparent, and what you end up with is is an impression of someone who's living his life in accordance to a demonstrably true religion, which gives him an entirely different perspective on events as Europe begins the run up to the First World War,
Mm-hmm.
and then the First World War takes place, and then its aftermath is explored. And I mean, this book came out in 1941, so
yeah, I'm looking at the trilogy was between 35 and 58, which means he wrote in the past if he's writing before World War One, but also he then was projecting it into the future, writing up to 1972.
Right,
that sounds interesting.
Because Lessingham dies at a tremendous age, after having actually carved out his own kingdom in a remote corner of Norway. But the sort of perspective that Lessingham has in light of his not quite of his knowledge of Zimiamvia, but of his faith in it, and particularly his faith in the notion that he and his wife have parallels in Zimiamvia, gives him an entirely new set of perspectives on earthly events, and I wrote an article about this, which was published in a book in 2015 called Baptism of Fire, which is about the the influence of the First World War on British fantasy, which is huge. I mean, it's the two great architects of modern fantasy, J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, were both World War I veterans, and neither of them was shy about pointing out that their wartime experience influenced their writing. Tolkien rather more so than Lewis, it must be said. Lewis does appear to ultimately have been sort of the braver of the two, ultimately. But I mean, it is a big deal, and it was a big deal on Edison as well, because I mean, Edison was slightly too old to be directly involved in the First World War, but he did. He was in his late 30s at the time.
He was born in 1882.
Yeah, so sorry, early 30s. Yes, so he's not military age, and also he was a civil servant. That was his day job, and so he had a sensitive government position, which kept him out of the war. So he didn't have any direct. It didn't have any direct experience of the war, but he had a direct experience of the culture that led up to it and the culture that followed it.
Right. And
he had some very definite things to say about both. And he uses fantasy to explore those ideas. And whether it's a science fiction or a fantasy is an interesting question. I mean, the first book that Edison wrote features Lessingham being transported from Earth to Mercury, but in order to witness a great war between the witches and the demons that live on Mercury.
Do you think fantasy has? I'm thinking about for the authors. I mean, I'm thinking about what these guys went through in World War One, etc. Has like the utmost ability for escapism. It's like what they've seen, what they've experienced. They want to get as far away from that as possible. And what could be further away than making up a new world, a new way of doing things, or the perfect knight at the end of the battle, makes the perfect decision and all the planets align, planets, so to speak. Are those life experiences not necessary, but you know how they always talk about, if you talk to a really, really good stand-up comedian, they've typically had a shitty childhood, or you talk to the best musicians and they're tortured souls. I wonder if the experiences and things like World War One or in those times were necessary to bring these literary works out.
Well, and that's an interesting question. I mean, there was a book written several years ago now by a guy named John Grant called Tolkien and the Great War, which is basically a biography of Tolkien, specifically looking at his military experience and his experiences of the war. And the deaths of most of his close friends in the war, but he in the postscript to that book, Grant speculates vaguely on what Tolkien's work would have looked like if he hadn't gone to war, and the best suggestion that Grant was going to come up with was that Grant could come up with, is that you would end up with something much closer to the works of William Morris, who was writing fantasy in the 1880s, 1890s, or I think slightly earlier than that actually. Which is, well, I mean, William Morris's fantasies are fascinating for all sorts of reasons of their own. They're remarkable uses of the genre, but they're much less directly involved with questions of morality.
Right.
Which is one of the things that really drives Tolkien's work. The Lord of the Rings in particular, but the whole Middle Earth legendarium in general is fascinatingly concerned with a quite eerily realistic depiction of human morality.
Well, imagine what you see in war, what you see in the trenches and stuff. You must see the worst of humans and wish for the best of humans.
Well, you see the best and the worst. Obviously, you see the worst and the best. Sorry, I mean, one of the points that people who the anti-Tolkien crowd often trots out is how dreadfully patronizing the depiction of Sam Gamgee is in the books, and it's, we say, well, yes, that's the Oxford educated middle class British wanker talking about the working class. And if you know anything of Tolkien's childhood, and if you know anything of Tolkien's background, that very quickly falls to pieces.
Right.
Tolkien didn't have a particularly comfortable childhood. He was orphaned at the age of 12. 12 or 13, I forget. A lot earlier than he should have been, is the point. He had no permanent home between the ages of 13 and 18. He was, and of course, very little in the way of any sort of moral support, from adults. It's not a comfortable middle class childhood by any means. Edison had a comfortable middle class childhood. Edison went to Eton College,
right?
So that's and came out of it probably the better for it, I would say, actually. It's interesting doing archival research at Eton. It's an interesting place to be.
You've been there yourself?
I have. I should tread very carefully here because I don't want to be misunderstood. I have been to Eton for the purposes of doing archival research on Edison.
Sure.
I am not in any way an alumnus of Eton.
No.
Which in this day and age is probably just as well, because particularly in Britain, last year or so, Britain went through one of the brief sort of palsies of fretting they go through as a culture, where they they start to get very, very worried that people may think that Britain is a historically Christian capitalist constitutional monarchy, and this is that Britain's not quite sure where people have picked up this dreadful idea, but they're determined to do whatever they can do to possibly diffuse this ridiculous misconception, which tends to run to a series of hand-wringing television documentaries about how Eton still exists and how dreadful that is.
So you've researched there, but you're not friends of Prince Harry, basically, is what we're saying.
And again, I personally, looking back at the sort of experiences I had at high school versus an English public school education, frankly, I probably would have jumped at the chance, but I went to I was in England in 2016. I had a summer to kill in Europe as I moved between academic appointments, and I spent it researching Edison in various libraries, which included popping to Eton and seeing what sort of records they have of him, which was slightly disappointing because he seems to have passed through the school as if he wasn't there. They had almost no records of him beyond a good solid attendance record, and of course part of the reason for this is that he was doing what ordinary teenage boys do when they're at high school, which is spending his lunch hours sitting down teaching himself Old Norse.
As you do.
Yes, as one does. He was fascinated by the literature of the Viking period, and which even in the 1890s still hadn't actually been translated into English most of it. And so he said, well, obviously the logical thing to do is I'm going to have to learn the language that it's written in.
Of course, that's what else would you do?
And so
I know that at high school I was spending my lunch breaks learning Latin, so it's pretty standard these days.
Yeah, I was learning Aramaic, biblical Aramaic, just for fun.
Just for fun.
No.
Yeah, see, I would say what I was trying to do, of course, was trying to compile an authoritative list of all the alien species that exist in the Star Wars universe. So we do what we do. But the best picture I can get of Edison's high school days is of someone sort of sitting quietly in the corner getting on with it.
Yeah. So he was wallpaper. He was there, but he wasn't making a big splash, and as you say, attendance, but not much else. He didn't make the first 11, so to speak.
Or the first 15. Interestingly, he never signed up for swimming lessons. Which was and I said I asked the librarian why would that be a matter of record, and he said, well, because regulations in Eton are that you don't get to participate in any of the school's rowing teams unless you can swim, He said, after a rather tragic incident in the 1870s,
Right.
that regulation was introduced and was very, very strictly adhered to, and of course it makes eminent sense. So he said what that means is probably, given how prestigious the rowing teams were at Eton, he said that probably means that Edison had no interest in that.
Interesting. If you wanted to, I mean, I've brought them up on Wikipedia as we've been talking.
The Wikipedia page is slanderously awful. No, seriously, it draws on some research by a scholar named Elsbreg de Camp from the 1960s and 70s, which is, as I say, utterly slanderous.
Without putting my seal of approval on the Wikipedia page, but looking at the books he's written, where are they still in print? Do you get them on if someone want, like, I'm interested.
They were reintroduced, or they were reprinted. There was a new edition of them all bought out in
92.
2092.
I think it was. I just saw it. Yeah, the Wikipedia page. Is this the one you're looking at here, just on the page?
Up the top.
The republish of the trilogy. Is that what you mean?
Everything that Edison did was republished, I think, in 2000 and 2015.
I'm just looking
There
at
was-
the trilogy was
If
republished.
the page has not been updated for a while.
Wikipedia mate onto it.
Mike Dickerson, yeah.
My own research on Edison has actually overturned a lot of the contents of that page.
Here's a question for you. If someone wanted to get into fantasy, what's a book they can start with? What's a story they should start with?
If they haven't already.
Yeah.
Well, I've often said that I don't think yet that Tolkien's Legendarium has been surpassed, either in terms of depth or scope, or indeed readability. I think
Starting with Hobbit.
You could do that if you wanted to. I mean, the difficulty with The Hobbit is that it is, at the risk of suggesting that it's particularly straightforward, it is intended for a child reader,
Right.
and as a result, there are a lot of what are called heterodiegetic interpolations. That the author talks to the reader a lot,
Right.
and does so in a way that an adult might speak to a child.
Right.
So
for an adult, it might be a bit patronising, might be a bit easy. But
yeah, well, and again, Elsbreg de Camp wrote an article about this, pointing out that there's absolutely no reason why anyone over the age of about 9 would bother with The Hobbit, because it's actually fascinating. Because de Camp was American, and he was writing primarily about British people.
Right.
And
In what era? When was he writing?
60s and 70s.
Okay.
And it's fascinating because he seems to it's rather like Walt Disney did with Mary Poppins. He seems to have regarded English people as a sort of separate species.
Right.
And he had all sorts of bizarre preconceptions about English people built into his narrative, which
Hence, I'm thinking Dick Van Dyke was an acceptable outcome.
well, something like that. He had sort of things like, Tolkien. He interviewed Tolkien, and Tolkien said, "Call me Ronald," and he said, "I thought this was remarkable because British people do not address each other by their first names," and all sorts of idiocies like that.
Can I just say, this is a complete side note. There's a new Mary Poppins movie. You know this, Jace?
Yeah.
And this is completely off topic, but I watched it with my kids the other day, and it's actually quite good.
Is it?
It's
that's good.
It's nothing surpasses the original kind of classic thing, but that new Mary Poppins and Dick Van Dyke's in it.
It's kind of a semi-sequel, isn't it?
Yes, it is a sequel.
So what role does Dick Van Dyke play?
He plays a very old banker, but the storyline is the kids, Michael and whoever they are from the first one, are now adults living in the same house.
Right.
And he has a battle again with the bank. And they have to, and it's referential. It talks about what happened in the first one. So, like, completely, but completely, yeah. That's the character he plays in the second one. He plays he's 92, and he doesn't speak with that accent. So,
Well, that's something I think we can all be grateful for. I think. Yes, I mean.
Do you have, obviously as an academic and certainly someone who studies fantasy literature, what do you like in other areas of fantasy? Like, is there something you're watching at the moment? Do you have particular fantasy movies you love? Like, you started talking about the Norse language there, and I straight away thought of the History Channel series Vikings. I love that series.
Right. See, I haven't seen that. Again, I have to say I don't currently own a television, which is not out of any particular aversion.
But then who watches TV on television these days?
Well, that's another point. I remember actually I was keeping up with fan engagement with Game of Thrones on YouTube as you do, and I came across an interview with Jason Momoa.
Yeah,
who is the fabulously intimidating actor who plays Khal Drogo in the TV series.
He seems to be the most amazing human being in the world, because not only is he this intimidating species of a human being, but if you look at any of his personal stuff, like his Instagram account, he seems to be the fucking nicest person in the world as well.
He is.
It's bizarre.
It seems to be something of a class act, yes.
Yeah.
But he was asked what his Game of Thrones viewing party is like, and I think his wife actually butted in and over the top of him and said we try to watch it on a TV if we can.
Yeah, if we can.
Which is
what's his wife's name? She was in Cosby Show.
Was she?
The old daughter.
I didn't. I wasn't paying enough attention.
He used to be married to
Show.
Lenny Kravitz. That's his wife. I forget her name right now.
Right.
Lisa Bonet.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Denise Huxtable.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that. Oh, well, there you are. That's that.
Yeah, I think and her daughter is Zoe Kravitz.
Right, and she was in the most recent Mad Max, wasn't she?
I'm not sure.
I'm pretty sure she was one of the.
I remember seeing something about Kravitz being in something.
Zoe Kravitz was. How common a name is Kravitz? I'm not sure.
No,
I think it was.
No, it is. Yeah, Zoe Kravitz.
Yeah, it's her daughter.
Yeah,
their daughter, was it? Yes. Anyway, yes. Yes, yes. Who watches TV on TV these days? I mean,
yeah, but do you have like Are you? I mean, if you're,
I'm not right now. No,
Vikings is very good.
So I'm told.
The series, for people who don't know it, the series of Vikings is what they've done is they've used historical characters and historical events, and then written a drama around it. So, for example, there's two characters.
This is exactly what Tolkien saw himself as doing.
Really?
Yep. Absolutely.
Even writing historical events, because what they do is they mix it up for TV. So there's a character Ragnar who is the main character for the first few series, and he has a brother Rollo, and both of these characters are historical real people, but they actually lived at different times and they weren't brothers. So, but they've put them together for the storyline. But the things that happen in their lives are historical events.
Well, see, then this is. Broadly speaking, this is sort of how Middle Earth sort of came to be.
Okay.
One of the stories that Tolkien was introduced to by a school teacher is the story of Beowulf. I don't know if are you familiar with the tale of Beowulf?
I look, to be honest with you, I have heard of the themes of it, but I don't know it. No.
Beowulf is I remember actually explaining this story from the ground up to an Iranian student in Sarajevo, and she was very impressed. So there you are. But it's the first really, I think the first really significant piece of poetry we have in English.
Yeah.
Is the tale of Beowulf, which is the story of a man named Beowulf, which is a name that means bear. And he is charging around. He spends his youth charging around Scandinavia, killing monsters and so forth. But he kills two monsters in particular: the great ogre Grendel, accursed of God, and then when Grendel's mother turns up aggrieved that her son is dead, Beowulf manages her as well. And he becomes a king, and he rules wisely and well for 50 years in a span of time that is passed over in 2 lines of the poem, and then as a very old man, he must face down a dragon, and he doesn't particularly want to because he's sort of past it by that stage. But he says, I'm still king. I still have to do it, and he does, and he does manage to kill the dragon, but he suffers fatal injuries during that fight, and he dies. And it's been pointed out, for example, that Beowulf's funeral at the end of the poem is a absolute dead ringer for Theoden's funeral in the Lord of the Rings.
Right.
It's lifted almost word for word directly from it. But
so is that homage or plagiarism? Where do you sit on that?
Well, I think homage is probably exactly the right word for it.
Enough.
But when Beowulf was first discovered in the 18th century, it's not a continuous tradition. We don't know exactly when the poem was written. It's anything from sort of about the late 7th to the late 10th century AD, and then disappeared without trace. It wasn't anything that anyone talked about until a manuscript was discovered in the 18th century, and people started reading it and said, "Gosh, this is like the earliest poem we have written in anything that could be recognizable as anything that eventually became English."
Yeah, wow.
And they said, why on earth would they write such a ridiculously silly poem? Because they said there's all this nonsense about fighting giants and giants' mothers and then fighting dragons and so forth, which take up so much of the poem, and yet this poem is clearly happening in the real world of early medieval Scandinavia. There are passing references to actual people
located in real time with fantasy elements.
Yeah, so they said, why on earth would anyone be doing? Surely they should have written a story about how Beowulf's time as king is compressed into, I think, 2 lines of the poem, and it's a 3,000 line poem. So
wow.
they said, surely what he should have been doing is they should have written 2,000 lines about that, and then maybe made some passing references to giants and dragons and so forth, or ogres and dragons and so forth, and so in a sense it's the term wild actually was repeatedly brought up with regard to Beowulf. It was said to be a wild poem, and a very early and primitive one, where people couldn't keep track of the difference between pagan mythology and Christian beliefs. There are a number of things in the poem that make it very clear that it's at least written by a Christian. Exactly what faith Beowulf himself is supposed to be isn't made clear, I think, but it's written from a Christian perspective, and then Tolkien came along and published an essay. Well, actually gave a lecture, I think, in I think it was 1946. No, that was earlier than that. I think 1936. I think he was well into his career by this stage. Where he said, well, that's not the point. You see, it's not a poem about how to be a good king. It's not a poem about wise and beneficent kingship. It's a poem about how to be a wise and beneficent person.
Right.
And in order to depict that, you have to depict someone going up against not only the worst thing that a person could possibly find themselves against, but the worst thing that a person could imagine themselves finding themselves against. And Tolkien said it is the reason that Beowulf is such a vivid, powerful person. The reason he's such an extraordinary, his human qualities shine out as vividly as they do, as indeed they do. I strongly recommend this poem, by the way. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
There was a wonderful translation of it into modern English by Seamus Heaney several years ago, which people might want to look at. He said that the reason that Beowulf is such a vivid, powerful person is that his humanity, his courage and bravery and his fidelity to his purpose and his strength and everything, all these solid human qualities that he has are most evident to us because they are being presented in relation to a purpose-written point of contrast, something that makes no pretense of humanity, something that isn't real, at all, but is there purely to provide a point of contrast to Beowulf. And Beowulf stands up against these most terrible of foes from the darkest corners of our imagination, and he prevails. And there's a section that I've been looking at because I had to introduce it into my most recent essay about Game of Thrones, where there are people who refuse to help Beowulf against this dragon, who won't go up and fight the dragon. Because it's too scary, and so Beowulf goes out. Almost only he has one person who's prepared to help him, and eventually Beowulf nails the dragon. He has a prolonged dying farewells to his colleague Wiglaf, who helped him fight the dragon, and then after he dies, the people who refuse to help him sort of creep out from where they've been hiding, and they look at the dead dragon there, which is lying coiled in a great heap next to Beowulf. It's a great long sinuous animal, this dragon. There's a wonderful image of it. It's excited out of its lair by someone sneaking into its lair and stealing a cup from it, a jeweled cup from its hoard, and it immediately notices the hoard that the cup is missing when it wakes up, and it comes out snuffling after the cup, going through. Yeah. And there's this wonderful image of this dragon snuffling through and it's just wonderful. Incidentally, that's also exactly the same thing that gets Smaug annoyed in The Hobbit. So there you are.
Yeah. I was just thinking the parallels there as well.
And that's not a coincidence.
No.
Wiglaf, the person who did help Beowulf, said, "Where were you?" And these other guys say, "Well, look at this. This is just an animal. We could have killed this." And Wiglaf says, "Well, yes, you could have, but you didn't. Beowulf did. This is his victory. It's on him, and you get to live in infamy forever." Which is exactly the situation actually that Cersei Lannister finds herself in at the end of Game of Thrones.
That's exactly what I was just thinking. That she chooses not to come on board and
get
squashed by a rock.
Well, she gets squashed by a rock, which that's certainly what happens in the TV series.
Spoiler.
It'll be interesting to see what happens to her in the book, because of course a lot of what's happened in the TV series can't actually happen in the books going forward.
Why so?
Well, the most obvious example is Sansa can't kill Ramsay Bolton,
right?
In the books, for the very simple reason that she never marries him.
Right.
The character who marries Ramsay in the books is another character, a girl named Jane Poole, who actually was in the TV series. The producers said, yes, that extra in the background there behind Sansa in that scene, that's Jane Poole, because she's throughout volume 1 of the books. Sorry, she sort of pops her head into the narrative, and she's horrible to Arya on a number of occasions. She's one of the characters that teases Arya. But it's her who ends up marrying Ramsay and being horribly mistreated by him. So
the books are going to find a different place. Are you excited by them coming out? Like, is it something that you're looking forward to?
I'm certainly looking forward to book 6. I look forward to seeing what happens.
Is there any concern about his health, George R.R. Martin? Like, is there any concern that?
Oh, good heavens! I mean, he's actually. There's actually a wonderful interview with him that was. I do remember seeing footage of it on YouTube, but I forget. I can't remember where he was actually, where this question was put directly to him, where they said,
what if you die before?
What if you die before the books come out? And he's actually he actually responds by flipping off the interviewer, because he said, what sort of a horrible question to ask is that, and it is. I have every confidence that Martin is working assiduously on the books, and that it is proceeding as swiftly as he can make them. And that I'm sure even from a purely commercial standpoint, I'm sure it'll happen. I mean,
speaking of books, we've been going for an hour and 10 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
This is like a little TARDIS for time, and here it flies by. And we didn't even get to talk about how 2 or 3 of those series of Game of Thrones stagnated. I was always a bit concerned where there seemed to be at least 1, if not 2 series.
Well,
It ended up, I just couldn't wait for the Queen of Dragons to get back and actually fight. She seemed to just sit out for about 2 seasons. It was annoying, and I know that was a part of your conclusions and your.
The very short version of the story I'm writing at the moment of the article I'm writing at the moment is that, as I said, Jon Snow's writing is narrating an intrusion fantasy. His story is predicated on his faith that there's something out there that he doesn't understand.
Right, something behind the trees.
Yeah,
that feeling we talked about earlier.
That's why he knows nothing.
Yep.
It's his job to know nothing and to suspect a great deal. And of course, at the Battle of Hardhome, he sees the Night King. And he says, right, that's what's going on. I know now. Jon Snow knows everything.
And be fair to say he's sort of, especially other than people who are with him, but the only person in power within that 42 main characters who does have all the answers.
Well, he published.
What was her name? Ygritte.
She came up with the thing. But I mean, Jon Snow publicizes this discussion, and we of course as viewers and readers know that Jon Snow is onto something, that this is what's going on.
Yep.
This has never been a story about the Iron Throne. This has always been a story about whether people can actually step up to this terrible challenge, as Beowulf did with his dragon. And so between Battle of Hardhome, the Massacre at Hardhome, which is episode 4.8 or 4.9, I forget. And the Battle of Winterfell and the Long Night, which is episode 70. I think episode 70. The whole story is basically revolving around one question: can Jon pull this off?
Right.
And in the end, he can.
Yeah.
And so again, I don't want to make too much of this, because I don't actually address the point in the book. This didn't occur to me until after the book came out. And that's why I'm writing about it now for publication elsewhere. But I said. For the entirety of season 6 and 7, again, it's there's just one question: can Jon pull this off? Can he get the 7 samurai together to fight the dead? And it turns out in the end that he can, which is something we can all be grateful for. But it removes the 2 things that Game of Thrones was famous for, which is moral ambiguity and narrative unpredictability.
Yeah, people who don't know stuff.
Yeah, because we know Jon is morally assured, and we know where the story is going. So, again, without wishing to suggest that I think that the last 2 or 3 seasons of the show are complete pants, which I think is what the ODT article sort of implied. And again,
you think the ODT didn't maybe quite represent your positions clearly enough?
The journalist and I are actually trying to figure out exactly where the mistake was. That's not quite what I meant. I may have overstated the point when I was talking to him, and I don't want to blame him for anything. But it wasn't. But what ended up being published wasn't quite what I meant. I didn't say that Game of Thrones could have ended at season 5.
Yeah.
I'm saying that at season 5. I'm saying the climax of the series, where Jon Snow knows everything now, is in season 5.
Yeah.
And that season 6 and 7 therefore are denuded of what people liked about Game of Thrones,
right? Which
is why people would dislike it.
Because the whole winter is coming thing is also the unknown. It's like winter is coming, but what's winter? And then he knows what it is.
Yeah, and I don't wish to actually make any determined personal opinion on this myself, or express any particular strong opinion on this myself. But I can see why there would be waning public interest in the show if the show is suddenly denuded of the qualities that people used to like about it. That's the point I'm trying to make.
Yeah.
And that was the point I possibly didn't make quite as well as I should have to the ODT.
Well, listen, your book, George R.R. Martin and the Fantasy Form, where can people get this from?
This can be purchased from the Routledge website. I understand Amazon have it last.
Yep, there you go, Kindle as well.
Well, okay, yep. There's a Kindle edition. That's good. There is an ebook edition which is cheaper, but I mean,
how does this work? There's one on the top right hand corner that says it's $117.57.
Yep. Well, that would be the hardback edition that you're holding in your hand there.
So what does this retail for?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
Again, it's an academic monograph. It's being produced by a company which is operating on very small margins and of necessity can't actually produce the books in quantities where economies of scale would kick in.
So is this more going to be found in academic sources rather than, for example, what calls a big amount on the shelf?
It's being marketed primarily to librarians.
Okay.
And so I would be very disappointed, for example, if the University of Otago Library didn't end up with a copy.
Yeah.
You can get it on Mighty Ape. I just saw before.
Well,
nice.
It is available. It's available to the general public if they want it. Yep. But it's looking at Martin from an academic standpoint as to how he does as to why he's as good at fantasy as he is, which is by getting the rules working to his advantage rather than breaking them. That's the.
Well, listen, this has been a fascinating talk. I feel like we could keep going for another hour if we wanted to. There's all sorts of things to talk about. It's sort of what we do here. We just chat until we're finished, and because of the time frame, and I know Jason's got somewhere to be at 12:30, and we need to kind of maybe start to wrap up. So I'll just say thank you, Joseph Young, for coming in. The book is George R.R. Martin and the Fantasy Form. We'll make sure we put a link to that on the Facebook page if people want to come and check us out, Department of Conversation. But other than that, this has been fun.
Well,
and
thank you.
Interesting and enlightening. And appreciate you coming in.
Yeah, well, it's been fun for me too. So thank you.
I don't have to watch Game of Thrones anymore now. I know what happens. So
people do, I remember I came across something in the New Statesman a while ago where it was a woman saying I watch Game of Thrones now because it's nice to watch something I have no engagement in whatsoever. and that's what that's one of the examples I've given of declining viewer enthusiasm. But again, that's the New Statesman, and they're preoccupied with making sure that everyone understands that Brexit is going to stop the hens from laying.
We'll be able to stop there. We'll start talking about Brexit, then we'll go for another 3 hours.
Yeah, we don't want to do that.
All
okay,
right, Joseph,
cheers.
thanks for coming in.
Thanks.